had a dream. My country was free, firmly standing on her own 2 feet, with grace and dignity. This the land where I am from, conjures visions of unicorns. Their beauty takes a unique form of the worldly, and yet forlorn. She needs at last to come together and to raise her voice. There are ties that must be severed to rise above the noise. Seize the day, seize the day, seize the day. All your hopes and dreams will surely fade away if you don't seize the day, seize the day.
Well, hello and welcome back to what is scheduled as the 11th episode of ayematters. The numerically clever amongst you will have spotted that there wasn't a 10th due to travel arrangements. We weren't on air last week, and I'm afraid to say we won't be on air next week either, because there are going to be so many votes with legislation coming back from the Lords that we've decided not to try it. It's just going to be too difficult to pull off, and it wouldn't be fair on the guests that we bring on to do that. So we've got some interesting press people to speak to, and we'll get them involved after the recess. But tonight we've got Dr. Lynn Wilson and Dr. Catherine Duffy with us, and a whole wide-ranging discussion on sustainable fashion and everything related. So I'm going to ask Lynn and Catherine just to introduce themselves. Lynn, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm Dr. Lynn Wilson. I am an academic researcher in the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow, and a circular economy consultant and specialist in sustainability.
Thanks. And yourself, Catherine?
Thanks. So my name's Dr. Catherine Duffy. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. Similar to Lynn, my research and expertise is looking at clothing consumption, especially when it comes to everyday clothing as mainstream consumers. What can we do differently that perhaps works towards being more sustainable?
Yep, thank you very much. So we've got a wonderful video from you to play, which is about, I think, 9 minutes. So we'll just play that just now. And if I can just remind everyone watching that if you could put questions in the chat, starting with the letter Q, just to make it easier for us to find them. If you haven't got a question just now, I can guarantee that you will have a question or two after you've watched this video. I watched it earlier today to check that everything played fine for tonight, and I learned so much that I didn't previously know that I kind of think, gosh, this is embarrassing, the number of gaps in my knowledge. So I know this is going to educate and inform, and it will stimulate questions. So we'll just go on and play the video to begin with. Let me find it. Here we go.
It can feel good to grab a bargain, but the price of our clothing is more than monetary. There are devastating human and planetary costs at every stage of the clothing system, from water pollution to modern slavery. Standing on Glasgow's Buchanan Street, we can see that clothing is big business, and in Scotland we consume 38% more of everything, including new clothes, than the rest of Europe.
With the average lifetime for a clothing item in the UK estimated at just 2.2 years and around £140 million worth of clothing ending up in landfill each year, buying less, choosing well and keeping clothing in use for as long as possible is one of the things that we can do to reduce their impact.
According to a recent report by Zero Waste Scotland, clothing is the most problematic product disposed of in the household bin and accounts for up to 32% of carbon emissions produced in Scotland. We asked consumers what leads to clothing disposal and share their experiences along with tips from experts on how to avoid clothing damage that leads to disposal. From moths to clothing wearing out, we share these challenges and how to overcome them when buying, using and disposing of clothing.
My biggest enemy is moths. That is my biggest clothing problem. I do have moth holes in this one, for example. This one's got quite a few holes and will probably have to go. Every so often I use a smoke bomb, but they keep coming back and I'm not quite sure what to do.
Clothes moths are a problem because they're protein eaters. In the wild they deal with carcasses, they eat dead animals and dead birds, they eat fur, feathers, skin and hair, human hair, animal hair, it's all the same to them. They like dark and undisturbed areas, the back of closets, inside pockets and collars, and they can create an awful lot of damage in a small space of time if you leave them undisturbed. In the museum world, we use a system called integrated pest management, which is a system of inspections and freezing. You can use your domestic freezer if you have a moth outbreak. You take your garments, you put them in a sealed plastic bag, such as a Ziploc bag or a plastic bag with tape on, and put it in your freezer for 2 weeks at -18 degrees. That should kill all the moths. And then when you take them out of the freezer, vacuum them to remove all the debris.
Always check for moth holes before buying second-hand. Check pockets and collars. Put second-hand jumpers in sealed bags and then into the freezer for 2 weeks. Then vacuum before wearing. Do a spring clean. Moths are most active spring to summer. Shake clothing out and make sure it's laundered and free of bacteria such as food before storing.
I'm a student on a budget and some of my clothes can wear out quite fast, such as jumpers that bobble quite quickly. I use the debobble tool, but they just come back. If they get a hole, I can usually repair them, but I tend to have other clothes that I wear until they're falling apart. Like bras and pants, they just don't seem to last.
A pilling comb or lint remover can help remove pills and fuzz, and the internet is a great source for how to fix and repair. In general, loose open fabrics tend to wear faster than densely knitted or woven fabrics. And while synthetics add strength, they can increase staining, odour and pilling when blended with a natural yarn. Buy the best quality you can afford for the intended purpose. Products that last are made from the right choice of fibres, yarns and fabric structures. So read product claims, reviews and recommendations and consider quality second-hand items. One spot, use and care for your product appropriately. Always follow the care label. I'd recommend using a wash bag, washing inside out, closing zippers and Velcro fasteners, using appropriate detergents, and wash darks and lights separately. Line dry more and tumble dry less.
So my partner wears a lot of t-shirts to the gym and they really tend to wear out really quickly and they get sweat stains on them. He just puts them in the bin and I go and get them out. Then I tend to wash them and put them in a plastic bag ready for the recycling bin. But I really don't know if I'm doing the right thing.
Everyday household products like baking soda, lemon juice and vinegar can be effective on stains, but always check the care label and don't use on delicate fabrics like wool and silk.
Check clothing care labels and try to select natural fibres where possible. Wash clothing less, but make sure to air clothing in between uses. Access cost-effective stain removal solutions by watching videos online and using household products. Use an old pillowcase as a wash bag to put your delicates such as underwear in when washing.
I try to put things I then think people will wear into the charity shop, but I just never know if they are sold or what really happens to them.
So in the clothing bags you can put all clothing and shoes and all household textiles, so the likes of bed linen, pillowcases, duvet covers. The only thing that can't go in here is duvets and pillows. Well, it needs to be in a plastic bag to keep the quality and to keep it contamination free, so it needs to be clean and dry for us to then process in our factory so that we can sort it for the best quality of reuse. So when it's brought into our facility here in Denny, we sort and grade it into over 200 different grades of material, which we call an end product, so it can be then sorted by quality and fibre type, and then we'll bale it into men's jumpers, women's blouses, men's jeans and so on. Anything that's not good for reuse, we will then sort for recycling. Household textiles that can be reused that we collect from our clothing banks, we send on for downcycling, which ultimately ends up in material like this, which is noise insulation for the motor industry, and also mattress topping that protects the consumer from the springs in the mattress. We are now looking at new technology, fibre to fibre, where we can pull the clothing and household textiles back into this candy floss type material that we call it. It is then put through a series of machines that is then spun back into this, and then ultimately it can be spun back into yarn, which can then be made back into new consumer textiles. So we sell to wholesale retailers, countries like East and West Africa, so Kenya and Ghana and Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, etc. We don't send anything unsorted, we don't collect it and then ship it abroad. We sort and grade it into what our customers ask for. So they'll send us a packing list and they'll ask for 50 bales of men's jeans, 50 bales of women's blouses and so forth, where it'll either be cut for wiping cloths for the oil and gas industry, or we'll send it on for further manufacturing into carpet underlay, noise insulation for cars, or mattress toppings for consumer mattresses.
Always put clean clothes in a clean plastic bag before putting in the clothing bank. Put all clothing items in the clothing bank, even your clean, used underwear. When donating to charity for resale, think, would you wear it? In our short journey through clothing use and disposal, we hope we've given you a flavour for some of the actions you can take to avoid and address everyday clothing problems. Taking you back to this shopping street, we ask you to consider if you love it before you buy it. Considering this avoids the human and environmental costs of resource extraction, production and distribution for every item we buy. To make the things you already have last. In the UK, continuing to actively wear a garment for just 9 months longer could diminish its environmental impacts by 20 to 30%. But this needs you to think about what you buy and how you care for it. And not to bin it. As we have shown, you can put most items in the clothing recycling bank. Just make sure you launder and bag it, and if given to the charity shop, mark it as a rag bag if the items are no longer fit for resale. This is a challenge for all of us, and these are problems and solutions for sharing.
Well, that's a really great film that you've given us there, and I mean, as I said earlier, I've learned so much just from watching it, and maybe it's because I'm a middle-aged male Scot that I didn't realise that freezer bag trick. So now, I mean, that alone is something I'm certainly going to put to use. But there's so many things there that I'm sure our audience will have questions. So do put them in with the letter Q. And we've got our first question from the general public, so I think we should start with that. I'll just put it up on screen. So Keith Barclay Photography says, so why is it that we in Scotland dispose of clothing so much more quickly than the rest of the EU? That's a very good question. Who wants to have a stab at answering?
Thanks. Thank you, and thanks, Keith, for the question. I just want to put some clarity on that. The statistic was actually that we consume more. So in Scotland, we consume 38% more than everything, more of everything, including clothing, whereas in England it's 44%, but that is in terms of the whole of Europe. I don't know if Kat would disagree with me, but I don't think we actually know fully why people consume more in the UK and in Scotland than they do in the rest of Europe. But it's something that we'd certainly like to understand more about in order to reduce that consumption.
Yeah, no, are we? I mean, I don't know. I'm just busking here as we're sort of live. I mean, are we buying inferior stuff that's just not lasting, and therefore having to buy more? And are we, try to save a penny and costing ourselves a pound kind of thing?
I think that's something that, Lynn, you've definitely found in your research, is that people don't necessarily understand the fibres in terms of what they're actually buying in a garment. So whether it's going to be suitable for what they think they're going to use it for. And in that sense, is it really the best purchase? Is it just a wear it once and then it lives in the wardrobe? So we do think there is an education piece around helping people to understand more what you're buying and what you can expect from that garment and how you take care of it so it's going to last much longer than that just one wear and wash.
Mm-hmm. Can I come in there, because having been brought up in the whole city of Denny, where you did a lot of your filming with Nathan's Waste Savers. So one of the interesting things on my visit to Nathan's was that they said that the countries that they send their recycled goods to waited and ordered from them specifically because of the quality of the goods that Scots had. That was what they told me. That was some years ago. And people tended to wait for our goods as opposed to the goods that were coming from America, which they suggested, if my memory serves me correct, Lynn, that the goods from North America were inferior to the ones that we used in Scotland. So this is one of the reasons I find this absolutely so interesting. So do you think my first question is, do you think that people actually, we the consumer, actually understand the problems we're actually causing to the environment in the first place? Is it actually registering with us as a consumer? And that goes back to the same thing about, so why should Scotland spend it different? From Norway or Denmark or countries that are even, you couldn't even put this down to the weather, I don't think. But as the chair of the Fashion Roundtable, not because of the way I look, by the way, just because I took the thing, not because I'm interested in the environmental aspect of this. How do we nudge people into a behavioural change to make them more aware of what you're actually buying?
Thanks, John. I'm just going to unpack some of your questions there, but but first of all, I understand you yourself have been involved in the fashion industry prior to your career in politics. I understand you were in the fashion and beauty business as a barber yourself, so obviously a keen interest. But in terms of what you were saying about Nathan's, one thing that's really interesting about what we can see through the recycling of our clothing is going back to Kat's point about fibre and what's in our clothing. And I'm not quite sure how long ago it was that you visited Nathan's, but say 14 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, what Nathan's were processing and sending to other markets would have been a much higher value fibre than it is now. So what we saw was that there would have been a lot of high value wool coming from Scotland. There would have been a lot of vintage and retro natural wool coats, jumpers. And what we saw was that around 2014, that started to drop off. And clothing is sold by the ton. So by a bagged up ton that we saw in the film. And so you could see the cost or the price of a ton of clothing drastically and dramatically dropping after around 2013-14, when we start to see a lot of polyester in our clothing. And we know that by we know that by 2030, up to 70% of what we'll be wearing is polyester based, is polymer, fossil fuel, petrochemical fiber. And so this is a real challenge in terms of people can buy clothing that's really inexpensive, really cheap, wear it once and pass it on. And so we do see a lot of clothing that is hardly worn in the clothing disposal system. But the key challenge is the quality of clothing. And so, for example, a few months back during the winter, I was asked about the value of onesies, wearing a onesie in the winter time instead when we were in the middle of the energy crisis, the fuel crisis. And the challenge we had with something like a product like a onesie is they are really cheap and accessible, but they're 100% polyester generally. And so polyester is a fiber that's not really good for us. We shouldn't really be wearing it next to our skin. We should always have a natural breathable fiber next to our skin. And not only that, what we then see with a garment like that is that it then bulks up our washing machine. So we have this whole big, like a big, sometimes polyester dressing gown or a onesie. Then we put it in the washing machine. It bulks up our washing machine. Then we have a key challenge of where to store all this stuff when we don't need it. So then what we see is that it's taking up storage in our homes. So we tend to throw things out like that seasonally, and then they go into the recycling system, or they go into the bin, and then cause a huge challenge to either the environment or are of less value in the recycling system. So in terms of education and behaviour, there is a lot of work to be done with consumers on what we're actually wearing and what is good for us. And of course, the challenge we have is that is balanced with what we can afford and how we access clothing and how we can educate ourselves to have potentially less in our wardrobe. They say that research from RAP says that up to 40% of the average wardrobe is never worn. So therefore, how can we reduce the amount of clothing that we have, but increase the quality of clothing that we have access to?
You want to come back?
Yep, thanks. That's really helpful. We're starting to get a couple of questions coming through. We've had Wolf Pet has asked, obviously in relation to the freezing section of the video, is it surely a hot iron, obviously suitable materials only, etc., would be at least effective and considerably quicker than freezing? What do you think?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question? Sorry.
Yep, sure. It's a question is asking if using a hot iron would be as effective as freezing for obviously dealing with the moth-related issues.
Well, I think the issue of heat is sort of, if you're talking about burning out a moth as opposed to freezing it out, I think the recommendation is always you're more likely to freeze and kill something off than to apply heat to it. But you've also got to be very careful with a hot iron and on any material, and make sure that you have another textile in between, say a garment and a very hot iron. Otherwise, you're going to flatten the fibre and you're going to create a bigger issue overall aesthetically and quality. So using a hot iron is something that I'm not familiar with myself. I don't know, Kat, is that something?
It's not something I've heard of. I think in terms of trying to be kind to your garment, I would agree with Lynn's comment, but I think also going from the textile conservationist that we spoke to in the film, she spoke about with moths, part of the issue is that you can't always see them. So what you're looking to do is to actually kill the eggs that are potentially in the garment, which then it becomes harder to know where to apply the iron. So I think if you're actually freezing it, you're cleaning out the entire garment rather than just localized areas.
Yeah, no, thanks. And we've had another one. Wolf Pet has said, "Do charities really want rag bags?" I think they can still get some money for rags, can't? I mean, I'm a long time since probably the stuff I give out is more rags than it is resellable, I have to confess. But that's maybe not a bad thing given the context of what we're discussing tonight.
It's a really great question, and it's really important given the new or recent information about that 4% of textile, 4% of the household bin is textile, which while quite a low percentage figure compared to something like food, creates almost as much carbon in terms of exuding of chemicals, mixing with materials. And so the idea that you can put everything in the rag bag is really important. And it was something that we learned as part of our research journey, was that, as Nathan's told us, yes, absolutely, as long, and they were really stressing, as long as it's laundered, as long as it's clean, then they will take everything and they will be able to then process it. And they told us that they have up to 200 different categories of sorting in terms of the garments and the textile that they receive. And they have numerous different customers that are going to take these rags. And of course, I suppose a key challenge is we all have different perceptions of what a rag is. But generally, if we all feel something that is really worn out, our underwear can be quite contentious. Women's underwear particularly. We learned that, say, for example, ladies' bras are really sought after, and something that the textile recycling industry has a customer for. Whereas I found in my research that most women were putting their bras in the bin because they didn't feel that they were suitable for passing on. So absolutely, yeah, rag bags, definitely bag them up. And what they also said was market rag bag. If you mark something rag bag, then it helps with the processing of it. That helps everyone to understand, okay, that's where that's going, and then we'll sort that when we receive it. Or the textile recyclers will sort it.
No, thank you for that. And obviously, the advice was to remember and wash and launder it first before disposing of it, which brings me to the one question that I always wonder about, and it's a hotly contested item in our house, is how often should we be washing our clothes? And I'm not asking you to settle a domestic dispute here. I'm sure we'll continue debating this in our house.
If you can settle a domestic dispute, you'll be a 24/7 call.
I think there's some basic rules, and I think that we know that anything that's immediately close to intimate areas of the skin, like our underwear, tights, anything that's in an intimate area, we should be washing them after one wash. We should be ensuring that in terms of preventing bacterial infections or anything that could harm us. It's really important to undertake those laundry processes. However, other things that are, so for example, Levi's would tell you to wash your jeans after 10 washes, no less than 10 washes, whereas you have other fashion jean brands such as Nudie who would tell you never to wash your jeans, that jeans will be naturally antimicrobial and will be self-cleaning, self-generating. So it is a personal issue, personal challenge, but I think it's about how we engage in the sensible sensible side of it. But what's most important is to be shaking our clothes. As we said in the video, making sure there aren't any foods in them, foodstuffs, that can attract small insects, not just moths, carpet bugs, any sorts of household bugs. So making sure if you have a dry area, if you have a dry outdoor area, if you have a washing line, that you put things out to air them. You can, if you have something quite delicate, like a shirt, you could hang it up in your bathroom, and when you're having a shower, and sort of steam it, just sort of gently give it a sort of hot steam when it's hanging up in the bathroom. So there are alternatives to washing every day. Of course, the thing that I'm mindful of is that it is challenging when you've got small children and you're washing clothing all the time. People are running around. And so it's not as easy as one size fits all. And it's, I think it is at the end of the day about that sort of being sensible and evaluating each piece of clothing and being honest with yourself and saying, do you really need to wash that a second time? But yeah, but that said, basic rules, anything in bacterial areas should be washed every day, every time they're worn after wear.
Oh, thank you. And again, you've given me ideas about using that extra steam from the shower, which I've used that for taking wrinkles out of suits in the past, but I hadn't thought of that as a freshening up clothes approach. So yeah, I can see myself doing that.
I think there's if I could ask you a question on this present generation of the modern society we're living in, this fast fashion that we're all living in. As you said in your video, everyone likes a bargain. Everybody wants to get something new and something fresh to wear. Of course, the difficulty then is you come on to disposing of all the clothing that you buy. And I love the thing you talked about, the fabric of society. I thought that was extremely interesting. But I wonder if there's something you could say, for example, if you ever read the book Nudge, about how to get some behavioural change into the way we think. That's really what you're talking about there, and what Martin's just mentioned about thinking about how we should do things a wee bit differently. And that behavioural change book, Nudge, goes on about how to get people to do things without them actually realising that they're actually changing their behaviour patterns. Do you think it should come from, like, the government needs to introduce stricter regulation about how we dispose of our particularly clothes in this instance? And there could we do something like going back to, for example, the Rana Plaza disaster, where these big, huge companies, I can't remember the figures, I think there was 1,134 people killed working in these slave, nothing better, couldn't say any more than they were just slave factories where I think H&M, Primark, all these household names in the high street were all operating in these places, and then they got a wake-up call, including, I was astonished to read that things like Burberry were actually used in these places. Is there something we could do that would stop that, prevent that fast fashion, low-quality goods like Boohoo coming on the market, like buying a dress for a £5? Surely that cannot be acceptable in this day and age. Catherine, would you like to say something on that one?
I mean, I think it's an incredibly complex issue, and I think it's something that has to be legislated at one end and then embraced by consumers at the other end. I think it was disappointing that in 2019, when the government undertook their Fixing Fashion report, that none of the recommendations were taken forward in terms of extended producer responsibility and actually addressing some of these issues head on. I think that's something that hopefully Fashion Roundtable and continued pressure, we're going to see some changes in the near future. I think it's incredibly difficult and complex because it's a global issue. It's not just a UK-centric issue, so the legislation needs to appreciate that. But I think from a consumer perspective, there is a lack of understanding as to the impact of overconsumption through into disposal, which is what we're talking about today. And I would like to think that the awareness that's been raised around, for example, plastic consumption and straws, that there's things that we could do that actually are not over responsibilizing the consumer, because as consumers, we're time poor and we have lots of things that we're trying to be mindful of and to care about. And it needs to be made easy for us. It needs to be made that there's an infrastructure that helps to support disposal and responsible buying. But I will pass over to Lynn because, as I say, it's a hugely complex issue.
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, we've worked on two things to potentially move things forward. And the first one was that we had the opportunity to present a white paper to the Scottish Parliament on the 19th of April, asking for, the paper was called Evidencing the Need for a National Citizens Clothing Circularity Strategy. And that is a sort of roadmap of acquisition, use and disposal in terms of consumer behaviour, and what we recommend a strategy might look like at a national level in order to increase clothing circularity, so to reduce the consumption of new clothes but increase clothing in circulation. And so we hope to take that forward in terms of a short life working group in the Parliament to address how we could make recommendations for future. And then the second one was working with the British Standards Institute on the very early stages of testing the water with industry, with the textile and fashion industry and wider policy networks for a sustainable fashion standard for the UK. And what's interesting about standards is that they are used by HM Revenue and Customs to monitor and regulate what comes into the UK. And so that could be a really helpful tool to support both consumers and industry to reduce fast fashion and fast product consumption and production. So yeah, that's just to give you an example of two of the sort of actions that we've been pushing for lately.
Can I just come back in and the point Catherine made earlier there, Linda? And so as I sit on the Environmental Audit Committee at Westminster, and that's over 8 years I've been sitting on that. So the Fix and Fashion report that the EAC produces remains the most read report ever in the Parliament. So there is a huge amount of interest in it. But again, you know, the public are well on board with trying to change this. It's always government legislation that lags behind the consumer will to do something about these things. But it did take, you know, almost a public humiliation to point out that Burberry had burnt £20 million worth of clothes and tried to dress it up as something that they saved the planet, or it wasn't. They didn't burn it at a high temperature, as if that made it all right. But that's the kind of marketing level that you're fighting against, I think, with these things. So, do you think, for example, the better labelling in products, you know, like some sort of traffic light system where people can make a choice when they go up to see that this is ethically sourced, like a, you know, a green, amber, red type of system would be beneficial? Catherine, or whoever.
I think providing information to consumers is the best way forward to allow people to make informed choices. I think how you distill that information down into a label is challenging, and also how you then ensure the label information is appropriate, adequate, and accurate, shall we say, in terms of what that looks like for the supply chain. I think there are moves in terms of EU where we're looking at almost a digital passport on labels. And I think that's an interesting shift forward, but also has accessibility issues in terms of, does the average consumer want to use a QR code to look up the journey of their garment? Is that meaningful to them? So whether a a traffic light system is something that's potentially more accessible. It might be. Lynn, what do you think?
Yes, I think there is a lot of work at a UN level being done on clothing labelling, and there is so much work to be done in clothing labelling. I mean, just thinking about where we started, about how often should we be washing our clothing? Labels, as they stand today, are quite antiquated in terms of the labelling system, and they're not aligned to sort of when I was at school and educated in home economics on labels in clothing. There is no pathway for consumers to decipher clothing labels. It is really left to you to understand it yourself. And so unless you do your own research, you don't actually are aware a lot of the time of what these labels are actually telling you. What does it mean when it's 30 in a circle? Do we all know that that's wash this garment at 30 degrees? So there is so much work to be done on labelling before we get to the point of what something like a traffic light system, which has been introduced in food, and there's a lot of evidence of how positive that's been. So there is a lot more research needed into understanding what it is that consumers are doing right now, and then what it is that they would be helpful to move this agenda along. I mean, in my own research, it is about working closely with consumers to understand what's happening, say, in the household, whether it's an individual or with a family, to see what the 24-hour life cycle of clothing is. What are we using? What are we not using? What are we using more of? What happens with a family that's growing up quickly? How can we, from a circular economy perspective, how can we increase the amount of clothing that's already in use? And how can systems like digital passports and RFID and other technologies support that tracking of clothing to keep it in use, to make sure that we know where it's going to end up so that we can prevent it from going to landfill, but that we can also increase these new models? And that goes for everything. So, for example, I heard of a scheme in local doctors' surgeries where in the winter time there was a peg, there was a coat peg, and if you were missing a winter coat, you could pick up a winter coat from that coat peg. And so I'm going slightly off track here, but I'm just wanting to illustrate the idea of circulating clothing, of accessing clothing, of sharing more clothing is really critical, because we know that there is enough clothing in the world right now for all of us for the rest of eternity, really. Yeah. We don't need to be producing more clothing, but we do need to be thinking about the problem creatively and thinking, how do we increase circulation, and how do we really engage with our local communities, households and local communities, to make sure that we keep clothing in use in those local areas. For example, in our recent research, we found that there's a 50-50 chance of what you donate to your local charity shop will actually be sold there. It's only likely to be 50%. And then it goes to the textile recycling merchant like Nathan's, who of course buy the clothing from the charities. So there is always a monetary element in the charitable clothing sector, but we do need to really rethink these models and rethink, are they working for us at a local level? Is there new ways that we can really make this community focused, thinking about 20-minute communities? How can we really use systems to track socially what we have in use, and how we can increase its use, clothing use?
Yeah, thank you very much. We we've only one other question at the moment, so just a wee reminder to folk watching. I know in previous shows we've had a whole lot of questions coming in quite near the end, and we never can get through them at the final stages. So do fire them in now if you have them. I'm sure you will have. We had one other question, which is to an extent been sort of covered, I think, was how to avoid buying clothes that have been produced in sweatshops, child labour, slavery sources. And I think the discussion on sort of the traffic lights might be covering some of that. I've got my own thoughts here, and I wonder if it should there be some sort of ethical marker that could be put on rather than trying to do it the other way, you know, a positive mark to say these producers are definitely okay, you know, rather than something like the fair trade mark, sort of equivalent for clothes.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, Martin, before our guests go in. But one of the earlier videos that you made, I think it was Rob Harrison and Professor Deirdre Shaw, you talked about the consumers are not part of the system. And obviously consumers should be part of the system because it's fairly obvious that we are the consumer. And I think the labelling idea helps you make these types of choices. I think it should be automatically. I mean, I don't even know why, for example, maybe they do. But if you go into some of the more ethical local places, they're quite happy to tell you where the product comes from, where it's made, if they put their own design on it. You know, like I was at a market yesterday in Moths area, and a girl from Stirling, I think it was, she'd bought her clothes from Bangladesh. She checked every week to say that everything that was made there was checked, rigorously checked, and she made the designs and she had everything made there. So these kind of things are existing as far as I can see. And I think the clue actually is, and the way to solve this is in the labelling itself. So some of the bigger brands, like the ethical companies, to me, like John Lewis, it should be quite easy for them to put up in store that they can identify every single thing in every stage that has come through where their clothing comes from, whether it's ethically sourced, sustainably, and there's no slave labour involved in it. To me, that seems fairly obvious. That should be a step forward, that companies that size or high streets, you know, or what's left of our high street, should be able to make these steps in their own without having to wait on any other legislation. And it's, again, it goes back, it seems to be into many other people, these are steps in the right direction. And the companies that are leading that way, and there are many of them now, should be given their first choice all the time in terms of circularity of the product you're getting. When you go to make the choice, it should be clear to you, looking at it, that you can actually dispose of it, which should go back into your charity or whatever way you want it to go. And anyway, I'm shut up at that because I can get going forever with circularity clothing. But I do know on the charity shops that was mentioned earlier, the charity shops are very good at identifying clothing, and they know where to put it where they can get a better price as well. So, in fact, I think a member of my own family, she's a walking charity shop. She's a great advert for buying clothes, never wears them and gives them away. Sorry, Martin.
No, it's okay. Keep going. We've got a few questions coming in. Some of them are not on the subject of tonight, but we've got one that is, so I'll do that one first. And it's, would the use of hemp be beneficial in the production of clothing for countering climate change? I can't say I know enough about hemp to have a view, but hopefully our guests tonight do. Who would like to have a go at answering this one?
Yeah, there's a wonderful, so flax is traditional to Scotland, and traditionally in our heritage has been a plant that's been traditionally grown. And there is a growing movement of people who want to who are reintroducing flax and coming together in communities. There is a global movement called Fibershed, who also have a group in Scotland and who are championing the growing of flax. And it's not just purely for the development of the fibre into a yarn and into a textile, which it takes an awful lot of flax plant to actually grow a textile, but it is about education and educating consumers about the relationship between the land and the clothing that we're wearing. And so there is quite a movement swell in Scotland to really educate consumers through that understanding of what can be grown on the land to create a new fibre for clothing. So at a global level, hemp and flax and other natural fibres are becoming more popular. But again, the challenge we have is that we also have nearly 8 billion people on the planet, and we have to balance agricultural land, crops for food, as well as crops for clothing. Therefore, at the end of the day, it really needs to be about how we reduce consumption and how we regenerate fibres already in circulation in order to reduce the need to grow new fibre.
Mm-hmm.
And I think very much just building on Lynn's final point is that our research, we're interested in how we can reduce consumption and support people in doing that, rather than just making small modifications, which I think is something we can all do. But if we want to shift the needle on this, we need to actually see a reduction in consumption. I think that's where circularity and making use of the clothing that we have in our own wardrobes is the most sustainable thing that we can do.
On that point, go back to the research. I wonder if you could tell us in the first instance where the research, the idea into the clothing, the manufacturing businesses came from for this project. Because to me, it seems it's long overdue with a proper research and proper understanding of where things come from and how we dispose of things.
So, well, there's quite a lot there. So, for myself, so Professor Shaw, that Dr. Duffy and I work with, has been working on this issue agenda for quite a long time. And then I came to work with Professor Shaw in 2017, and I had come from Zero Waste Scotland, where did have a national circular clothing strategy. But for some reason, after 3 years, that was decided that would no longer continue. And whilst that was the sort of first work that was done on engaging consumers in clothing circularity and working with the recycling sector, textile recycling sector, to increase clothing recycling, increase quality of clothing recycling, and increase consumer awareness. So since then, it's been, I think Kat can talk more about this, about the different strands of research that are going on into consumer use and disposal. But I think the key challenge for me is that globally, 92 million tons of clothing goes to landfill. And recently, there was an aerial view of an area in Chile that could be seen from satellite, where there was acres and acres of clothing that had been dumped. And so we really need to identify ways to eradicate clothing being landfilled and circulated. And so the way that I wanted to approach it was to, as I said earlier, is to start by understanding what's going on in the household, what's going on in the family home, what are people actually doing, what are the challenges they're facing, what's their behaviours, how can we, the more that we understand about what's going on and the more that we research, the more that we'll be able to identify solutions to keep clothing in circulation.
Thank you very much. I think that leads on quite nicely to one of the questions that we've had come in. Graham Eason's asking what more do we think could be done at a community level, and he's suggesting school swap shops, shoe banks, community clothes cafes, sports equipment clubs and stuff like that. What's your thoughts on all these ideas? They sound quite worthy.
Would fully agree with Graham. I think, as Lynn mentioned, this idea of the kind of 20-minute community and what can we embrace at a local level, I think is so important in how we address some of these issues. So being able to circulate clothing locally, I love that idea of the doctor's waiting room and turning that into a safe space for accessing clothing. I think that's something really easy to implement. Something we've not touched on too much tonight, but repair, I think, is a really huge growth area in terms of circularity and keeping clothing's a suitable quality level that they can go on and have multiple lives. And we have expertise in local communities as to tailors and seamstresses and cobblers and trades that in some ways have been taken for granted, and these need to be foregrounded and actually a kind of key part of our local community that's the backbone to making this all function and function well.
Totally agree. If you want to change the world, get busy in your own little corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what they say, isn't it? The big picture is made up of little ones.
Yes, indeed.
Aye. So we've had a couple of questions that are off subject, so I'll just give them a shout out. Bessie Branster is asking about West Lothian respite care. It's not a subject for us for tonight, but if you want to email in, we can certainly let you know what we think is happening there. But as you point out, it is a local government issue, and the other functions are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So the Westminster side is not really one that's on dealing with that. And the Yes Cafe is wishing John all the best with his retirement from Parliament, and basically is asking. Now it's a long question, but I'll just try and get the nuts of the question here. So apart from being able to spend more quality time with your family, what are you most looking forward to when you retire from Westminster, and what aspects of frontline parliamentary political life do you anticipate missing?
I'll take the last question point first. I've enjoyed the camaraderie down here. Met lots of good people with lots of good ideas. I particularly like the environment issues and everything that surrounds the environment, and I would hope to continue that at a local level if my wife allows me.
I can't imagine you not having an opinion and expressing it locally, John, I've got to say.
No, I would like to think that I would put the time I've spent here to good use at a local level, and certainly felt more effective at a local level in local politics and bringing people together and getting your community to work for each other. And I absolutely believe in what you guys are doing. I think the self-help idea, where people become more aware and are more educated, is the key to everything. And drive it yourself. Don't have to wait for somebody else. But yeah, I'm looking forward to spending a bit more time at home. Probably growing my own. Started off growing on my own fruit, vegetable, cherries and berries, and been able to phone up one of my colleagues down here on a Tuesday morning saying, how do you fancy a game of golf today, Douglas, instead of travelling to Westminster?
Well, I bet you don't miss the travelling. I can
travelling is exhausting.
I have one sort of final question for our guests that's been thinking back to what was in the video. There was a reference to encouraging us to try and wear our clothes for an additional 9 months. So I thought, well, yeah, that's an interesting one. What should the lifespan be of, say, a typical jumper or a typical pair of trousers? Or because I think, I'm sort of wondering. I mean, I suspect I might be breaking some of the records, which I'll tell my partner now is a really positive thing, although she gets a bit concerned about the age of some of the stuff I've got. But how what should be the expected lifespan that we should get out of one of these items of clothing?
So that's a really difficult question based on the quality of the clothing that is available and sometimes the limited knowledge that we have about clothing. But I think the golden rule is always, unless you think you're going to wear something at least 30 times, then maybe reconsider your purchase. So keeping something in use for as long as at least 30 times is, is sort of advice that we'd offer.
I think keep it for as long as you love it and then make an informed decision about where it goes next. Give it the best possible life.
Yeah, that's great. We get a lot of comments and we try and focus on the questions, so we sometimes miss the comments, but I think there's a nice one there from Evelyn Hume saying that the local school has a recycle area for school uniforms and sports gear, and I think that's a real positive thing, especially since many kids will outgrow stuff before it's anywhere near done.
Yeah.
So that's really something I would support and encourage. We also, from Evelyn, had a question which is a political one, again off subject, but I think it's worth just a mention because it's such an important thing coming up. Is the Scottish Government going to run a campaign on voter ID for young people that they don't have any? And I think voter ID is an interesting one because in Scotland, it's only going to apply to Westminster elections or UK held referenda. So Scottish Parliament and council elections will not require voter ID, which I think will add another element of confusion. I think it's the right decision not to do that in Scotland. It's not necessary. So the answer is I don't actually know, because technically they don't need it for a Scottish election, but it's certainly something we need to raise awareness of. And I think the by-elections in England next week will highlight quite dramatically the numbers of people who've been turned away without valid ID.
Exactly.
So hopefully that helps get the message out. It's up to all of us to encourage people to make sure they have the ID, and it is disproportionately younger and disabled people that will be disadvantaged from that. So hopefully I think we've managed to touch on every question that's came in, and I apologise if I missed any. If I did, it was inadvertent. Because we do get a lot of comments coming up from the different channels, but I think we have picked up everything, and I'm very grateful to both of our guests, Lynn and Catherine, for coming along tonight. And as I say, I've certainly learned a lot from the discussion. So thank you very much, and I'm sure the audience have as well. Is there any final points you would like to make before we switch off?
Yeah, could I just make a request, actually, that in our film, in the 8-minute film, there is a QR code at the end, and we'd really love it if people were able to click on the QR code, and it's just a really short 4-minute questionnaire, and we just want to try and understand what people have taken away from our film, and if there's any tips or any feedback that they want to share. So we would be really grateful if they could I think you just put your phone up and you click on the QR code and it takes you to the survey. Thank you.
Right, yeah. Well, you can all get that on whatever platform you're watching on by spinning back the video to early on in the show, which must have been about 10 minutes in, would be my guess, and you'll get the tail end of the video. So please do that, and thank you very much. So with that, we will sign off, and we will see everybody. I say apologies that we won't manage a show next week just because of the final week of Parliament before recess and the sheer volume of votes that they're getting through. But we will be back after the summer recess at the start of September, and we will let everyone know what exciting guests and subjects we have coming up then. So until then, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.